Red Bluff, Colorado Territory, April 1882. The sun had barely cleared the ridge behind Granger's Hill, spilling gold and dust across the town's cracked streets, when the crowd began to gather near the schoolhouse. Voices hushed to a murmur as the tension rose, the kind of stillness that comes just before lightning. They'd all seen him, leaning against the post in front of Miller's General Store, arms crossed over his broad chest, one boot braced against the wooden frame like he didn't care whether the world burned or not. Buck Garrison, the giant, 6'4", shoulders wide enough to cast shade on both sides of the street, scar over one brow, old cavalry boots, brown cowboy hat pulled low, vest worn smooth at the seams, and a silence about him that could knock the wind from a room. Folks said he didn't speak unless he had to, and when he did, it was like gravel scraping over bone. Nobody dared ask about the scars on his knuckles or the way he watched everything from the corner of his eye. Most of the children crossed the street when they saw him. Parents gripped little hands tighter. Stories had spread whispers, mostly about what he'd done before he came to Red Bluff. Some said he'd been a bounty hunter. Others claimed he'd killed 6 men in one night. But it was what they said in hushed tones that stuck the longest, that he'd lost everything in a fire, that the fire hadn't been an accident, that when he found out who'd lit it, he hunted them down, and didn't stop until the last one begged. He'd lived in a cabin by the creek ever since. Alone, silent, untouchable, until that morning, until her. She was just a slip of a girl, couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with a mop of tangled brown curls and a pale blue dress that had been mended too many times to count. She walked barefoot, carrying a cloth doll missing an arm and dragging a wicker basket nearly half her size. The people standing around the schoolhouse barely noticed her at first, until she stepped away from her aunt's grasp and walked straight toward the man everyone feared, straight toward Buck Garrison. You could feel the air pull tight like a stretched rope. A hush fell so deep even the flies stopped buzzing. Fay Caldwell stood alone now in the middle of Main Street, chin lifted, green eyes fixed on the giant cowboy as if she'd known him her whole life. "They said you eat children," she said. Every soul in earshot stopped breathing. Buck looked down at her, blinking once, slow. His jaw tensed beneath his beard, but he said nothing. Didn't move, didn't flinch. Then, without another word, the little girl dropped her doll, stepped forward on dirty feet, and wrapped her arms around his legs, held on tight. Gasps rippled through the street like gunfire. Sheriff Hayes, halfway out the jailhouse, froze with his hand near his holster. Mrs. Henderson dropped her school ledger. Even Doc Morrison, who'd stitched up more bullet wounds than any doctor west of Kansas City, looked like he might pass out. But Buck Garrison stood completely still. His fingers twitched once at his side, not toward his gun, toward her. She clung to him like she belonged there, like she'd chosen him on purpose, like he wasn't the town monster, like he was something safe. The hug lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it cracked something no one else had managed in 3 long years. He looked down at the girl, noticed the freckle under her eye, the tear in the collar of her dress, the way she smelled like wildflowers and dust. "You ain't scared?" he asked, his voice low, unused. "No," she said matter-of-factly, still holding on. "You don't look hungry." Someone laughed a sharp, nervous sound and was quickly shushed. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Fay," a voice called from the schoolhouse steps. Her aunt, Martha Caldwell, was white-faced and trembling, one hand on her chest. "Fay, come back here right now. You don't talk to strangers, especially not—" "I ain't talking to a stranger," Fay said, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm talking to Mr. Buck." She looked back up at him. "You're sad," she said, like it was the simplest fact in the world. "Just like me." Buck couldn't breathe for a moment. The girl was still holding his leg. The heat of her small hands bled through denim and memory. "Come now, child," Martha called again, hurrying over. "You have no idea." "I know enough," Faye said softly, letting go. "He's not scary." "Just sad." Martha grabbed her niece's arm, not roughly, but with clear intent. Her eyes never left Buck. "Mr. Garrison," she said cautiously, "forgive her. She's had a hard time of it, and she doesn't always understand things properly." "She understands just fine," Buck said. It came out rougher than he meant it to, and Martha stiffened. "I didn't mean disrespect, sir," she said quickly. "But you know how people talk." "I do." "Then you understand why I have to protect her." Buck looked at the child again, Faye, the girl who hugged the monster. He gave the slightest nod. "I understand." Martha tugged the girl back toward the schoolhouse, muttering thanks and apologies. But Faye glanced back at him once more, eyes steady. "You're sad," she repeated, almost in a whisper. "Just like me." And then she was gone. The street slowly returned to motion. Folks whispered. Sheriff Hayes watched Buck like he might grow wings or explode. But Buck stood still. Inside, though, everything moved. He hadn't touched another soul in over a year. Not since the widow Patterson shook his hand after he fixed her porch. Not since that handshake had lingered too long and she looked into his eyes and saw something that made her step back. No one had hugged him in 3, not since his daughter. Her name had been Emma. She'd loved wooden horses and blackberry jam, and once told him that stars were the freckles of angels. She was 6 when she died, just like Faye. Buck walked back to his cabin that evening slower than usual, dragging his shadow behind him like a second ghost. He didn't light the lamp, didn't cook dinner, just sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the fireless hearth until his bones ached. Then he stood, crossed the room, and pried up the floorboard he hadn't touched in over a year. Inside the hollow space lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it slowly. A tarnished deputy's badge, a cavalry saber, a wedding ring too small for his thick fingers. And beneath them all, his daughter's hand-drawn picture of him taped to a splintered wood plank. A smile scrawled onto his face in crayon. One word at the bottom, misspelled but true. S-A-F-E. The drawing trembled in his hand. Then, as if conjured by memory itself, a knock echoed at the door. He turned, heart pounding, opened it. And there she was again, Faye standing on his porch, barefoot, holding a battered biscuit tin in one hand and her one-armed doll in the other. "Mama used to say sad people don't always stay that way," she said. Buck blinked. "I brought you supper," she added. And just like that, the most feared man in Red Bluff let a little girl walk into his cabin. Because sometimes monsters weren't monsters at all. They were just men who forgot how to be loved, and sometimes it took the smallest arms to hold them together long enough to remember. That night, the fire burned long, and in the town that still whispered behind his back, no one knew that something old and broken inside Buck Garrison had just taken its first breath in 3 years. Tomorrow, trouble would ride toward Red Bluff in the form of men with rifles and old scores to settle. But tonight a little girl had hugged a giant cowboy and called him sad, and he hadn't denied it. He'd let her see him, and he didn't turn away. The next morning, Buck was splitting wood behind his cabin when he heard the faint crunch of small footsteps in the gravel path. He didn't turn. Not yet. The rhythm of his axe split through the stillness, each strike deliberate, each motion smooth as breath. But he knew she was there. And sure enough, a moment later, a small voice piped up behind him. "I brought biscuits." "They're only a little burned." He turned slowly. There she stood, Faye. Hair wild, dress wrinkled, one foot bare and the other in a shoe 2 sizes too big. She held out a dented tin with both hands and gave him a look that was half challenge, half offering. Buck wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, eyeing the tin like it might explode. "Your aunt know you're here?" "She's quilting with Mrs. Thornberry," Fay said cheerfully. "I told her I'd be in the backyard." "I just didn't say whose." She gave a wide, gap-toothed grin that had no business being so fearless. He hesitated, then stepped forward and took the tin. It was warm. "Thank you," he said, his voice like gravel. "You're welcome." "I didn't make them," she added quickly. "I just didn't want to eat them alone." Buck raised a brow. Fay plopped down cross-legged on the porch like she'd done it 100 times before. Her doll, missing one arm and a button eye, was tucked under her arm like a soldier at rest. He stood for a long moment, unsure what came next. Then finally he walked over, sat down on the top step, and cracked open the tin. The biscuits were indeed burned, but he ate one anyway. Fay watched him carefully. "You don't talk much, huh?" Buck chewed, shrugged. "My mama said men who don't talk usually think more, but my papa snored so loud at night, I don't think he had any thoughts left by morning." Buck coughed softly. It might have been a laugh. Fay brightened like she'd just won a prize. "That's the first sound you made today that wasn't wood or grunting." He muttered. "I'm gonna count how many words you say," she declared, pulling a piece of string from her pocket and tying a knot. "That's one." "I don't think that counts," he said. She tied a second knot. "That's two." He stared at her, then gave the faintest shake of his head. It had been a long time since someone talked at him like this. Most folks left him to silence, but she filled it like it was her job. "Is it true you were a sheriff?" Buck stilled. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. "Tommy's mama said you had a badge once, and that you rode a big black horse named Glory. Is that true?" He glanced at her. "I rode a horse named Glory." "She died." Fay's expression turned soft. "Oh, I'm sorry." He nodded. She was quiet for the first time in 10 minutes. Then she pulled her doll onto her lap. "This is Miss Pearl. She's been mine since I was a baby. She used to have 2 arms, but so did Papa." Buck blinked. "What happened?" "Wagon rolled." She said it like she was explaining the weather. "We were crossing a river, the axle snapped. Papa went under. Mama screamed a lot. After Aunt Martha took me in." Buck watched her face. She said it all so plainly, like she'd rehearsed it for adults who didn't know what to do with sadness. She stroked the ragged yarn hair of the doll. "Miss Pearl listens good. But she don't talk back. You talk enough for both of you," Buck said before he could stop himself. Fay beamed. 3 knots. The morning stretched into a slow stillness. The breeze carried the scent of pine and sun-warmed earth. A hawk wheeled overhead, circling in silence. Buck watched it, remembering a time he used to see omens in things like that. He'd long since stopped looking for signs. Now here was one, sitting next to him, counting his words. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," he said finally. "I do too," she whispered. They sat like that for a while, a child and a giant, a broken doll and a man with nothing left to protect. Buck reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of pine he'd been whittling for days. It was rough, but taking shape 4 legs, a tail, the curve of a mane. He turned it over in his hand a few times, then held it out. She stared. "For me?" He nodded. She took it like it was made of gold, turned it gently, studied every cut. "It's a horse," she said. "Yes." "Did you make it?" "I did." "What's his name?" Buck hesitated. "He doesn't have one." Fay's eyes lit up. "I'm gonna call him Thunder." "Good name," Buck said. She nodded solemnly. "He's fast." "I can tell." You think so? I know so. Thunder's gonna take me everywhere when I grow up, to the mountains, to the ocean, maybe even to the moon. If they build stairs, Buck looked down at her. She had Thunder cradled in her arms like he was real. Her fingers touched the grooves he'd carved, reverent and careful. He'd spent his whole life making things meant to last. But this might be the first thing he'd made that truly mattered. Buck? Are you gonna be my family now? The question landed soft but deep, like a feather dropped in a well. He looked at her, really looked. This child who had walked into his life like sunlight through smoke. She didn't know about the blood on his hands, the nightmares that still yanked him out of sleep, the guilt that gnawed at him every day the sun rose. She only knew the man who gave her biscuits and wooden horses. He didn't answer. Not yet. Couldn't. But Faye didn't need him to. She laid her head against his arm and said, "That's okay. You don't have to decide right now, but I already did." He looked out toward the ridge where storm clouds were starting to gather in the distance, low and slow. Something was coming. Trouble always did. But for the first time in years, Buck Garrison didn't feel hollow inside, because now someone might be waiting for him when he came home. And trouble, well, trouble would have to go through Thunder, and through her, and maybe, just maybe, through him. The wind had shifted that morning. Buck could feel it in his bones, the way an old dog knows a storm before it shows its teeth. The sky had turned to ash, the scent of rain hung thick. But it wasn't the weather that made his hands stiff. It was the dream again. He hadn't spoken of it, hadn't even allowed himself to think too long on it in the daylight. But when darkness pressed against the walls of his mind, the memory returned, as sharp and cruel as it had been 3 years ago. Gunshots, a child's scream, a woman's last breath whispered through pine trees. He rose from his bed before the sun did. The cabin creaked as he crossed it barefoot, his weight careful against the old floorboards. Faye was curled on the makeshift cot by the fire, Thunder tucked against her chest, her lips parted in sleep. Buck paused. He didn't understand how she'd managed to dig her way under his skin so fast. But here she was, wrapped in a threadbare quilt that once belonged to someone else, breathing peace into a house built from ghosts. He knelt by the hearth, fingers trailing the grooves in the wooden floor until they found it. A single plank, smoother than the others. He pressed down on the right side, and it popped loose. Underneath lay a hollow compartment wrapped in silence and dust. He reached in. First came the badge brass, dulled by time, edges worn smooth from years of wear. Buck turned it over in his palm. The word sheriff still gleamed faintly in the morning gloom, like a voice long quiet trying to speak again. Next, a sword. Not for killing, but for ceremony, his father's, handed down the day Buck was sworn in. It still bore the etching along the hilt. Justice, tempered with mercy. Buck touched the edge. It was still sharp. Then the Colt revolver. Black steel, cold, familiar. He hadn't fired it since that day. The memories came fast now, uninvited. The porch light swinging in the dark, the baby crying. The way her hands reached for him even as she fell. He slammed the plank back in place. Behind him, a sleepy voice broke the silence. Was that a treasure box? He turned. Faye was sitting up, rubbing her eyes with one hand, Thunder tucked under her chin like a talisman. Buck didn't speak. I heard wood crack. I thought maybe you were hiding gold, she said, brightening. Or cookies. No gold, he said. She slid off the cot and padded over. What was in it? Old things. Like fossils? He shook his head. Memories. She looked at him for a long time, then gently reached for his hand. Sometimes the things we bury are the ones we miss the most. Buck didn't pull away. She noticed the badge, still clenched in his fist. You were a sheriff. It wasn't a question. I was. What happened? He looked away. Bad men. Came in the night, took everything. Faye didn't ask more. She just sat next to him, legs swinging off the edge of the hearth. My mama used to say that when you lose someone, the world gets quieter. He nodded. She was right. Faye reached into the small pocket of her patchwork dress and pulled something out. It was a silver ring, dull and bent, with a missing stone. This was hers. I was gonna trade it for licorice at the general store, but the man said it wasn't worth nothing. She held it out. Buck frowned. You should keep that. I want you to have it. I can't. It's not for trading, she said gently. It's to remind you. Of what? That love isn't gone just because they are. The words landed like thunder in his chest. He took the ring slowly, turning it between his thick fingers. I don't know what to say. You just did, she smiled. The fire cracked beside them. Outside, rain had started to fall in slow, even drops, the kind that soaked deep. Buck reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the badge again. This time he didn't hide it. You think Thunder would let me ride him someday? Faye asked suddenly. He smiled. Thunder might need some legs first. I can wait. They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need fixing. Faye leaned her head on his shoulder and he didn't move. But in the distance, beyond the trees and hills that guarded his solitude, hooves were coming. 6 riders, moving slow but deliberate. One of them wore black gloves and a smirk, and in his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, was a letter from a judge who still remembered Sheriff Buck Garrison, and wasn't done with him yet. The news didn't ride in on a horse. It drifted down through wagon whispers, caught on the wind from the northern hills, clung to the broken boards of the saloon porch, and curled like smoke in the corners of every home. The Crimson Creek gang was coming back, and this time they weren't passing through. Buck first heard it from the old postmaster, a wiry man with no teeth and too many stories. They took a rail town 2 counties up, he'd mumbled, folding up a torn telegram with shaking fingers. Set the courthouse on fire, said they're heading south, said Marcus Webb was leading now. The name hit Buck like a bullet to the spine. Marcus Webb. It had been 3 years since he last heard that name spoken aloud. 3 years since that night burned itself into his memory. 3 years since Marcus Webb looked him in the eye and pulled the trigger on a life Buck would never get back. Buck said nothing. He turned, walked out of the post office, and didn't look back. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat on the front steps of the cabin, sharpening his old hunting knife out of habit, more than need. The stars were dim behind a thin veil of cloud, and the wind carried a chill that didn't come from weather alone. He didn't know how long he sat like that before Sheriff Hayes rode up the path. The man hadn't changed much. Same thick mustache, same way of tilting his hat like he was waiting for bad news to land on his shoulder. He dismounted slow, hands raised in something between surrender and respect. Didn't mean to come uninvited, Hayes said, but I figured if anyone had a right to know what's coming, it's you. Buck said nothing. Hayes looked around. She's sleeping. She's inside, Buck muttered. Good. Hayes kicked at the dirt with the toe of his boot. They're not rumors, Buck. Crimson Creek is coming south. Webb's boys hit a ranch outside Dry Hollow last week, left no one breathing. Buck's jaw flexed. You know he's looking for you, Hayes said. Word is, he's been waiting. Says unfinished business always leaves a man restless. He should have finished it, Buck muttered. Hayes shifted. Look, I know what you've been through. I was there when they pulled you out of that wreckage. Hell, I was the one who shut your badge in that drawer. I didn't ask for visitors, Buck growled. I'm not here to pull you back, Hayes said, But if Crimson Creek gets anywhere near town, you think that little girl inside's gonna be safe? You think any kid will?" Buck didn't answer. He couldn't. "You don't have to be sheriff again," Hayes said, quieter now. "But maybe it's time you stopped being just a ghost." The sheriff tipped his hat and mounted his horse. Before he turned to leave, he added, "Town's holding a meeting at the church come Sunday. People are scared, Buck. Good folks. They need someone who's faced monsters." Before Buck watched him ride off, the sound of hooves fading into the hush of the hills. The next morning, Buck went into town. He didn't wear the badge, didn't carry the Colt. He just walked, past the bakery, past the smithy, past the stairs that followed him like shadows. The town still remembered. Fear doesn't forget easy. He stopped at the general store. Faye was there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, with a half-circle of other children around her. She was holding Thunder in one hand and a pine cone in the other, explaining quite seriously how pine cones were actually sleeping baby porcupines. The other kids laughed. Not at her. With her. The shopkeeper, a woman who'd once crossed the street to avoid Buck, now smiled at Faye like she was her own. Buck stayed at the doorway, invisible but watching. Faye looked up. Their eyes met. She beamed, waved. The other children turned to see who she was waving at, then hushed. Some scooted back. One whispered, "That's the man who lives in the woods." But Faye just stood and walked over, small boots tapping across the wooden floor. She tugged at his sleeve. "I told them you don't eat children." Buck raised an eyebrow. "I told them you don't even eat much of anything, really." A chuckle caught in his throat before he could stop it. "Are you sad again?" she asked softly. "Not right now." Faye tilted her head. "Then what are you?" He looked past her, out toward the horizon where the hills darkened. "Thinking," she nodded. "About the bad men?" "Yeah." "Are they coming?" He didn't answer. Faye reached into her coat pocket and handed him a folded drawing. "I made this for you." He opened it. A stick figure, broad shoulders, tiny hat, stood next to a smaller one holding a wooden horse. Above them, in shaky letters, was written, "You can be safe here, too." His throat tightened. Buck folded the paper carefully, like it was something sacred. He looked down at her. "You want to ride Thunder again today?" "Yes." "Then we better get back." "He's probably eaten all the carrots." She laughed and ran ahead. Buck followed, and behind him, in the quiet of the store, a man in a black coat took note. He waited until Buck was out of earshot, then pulled the note from his pocket. It was signed by Marcus Webb, and it said only one thing: "Found him." Buck had never known how much silence could weigh. It hung over the cabin that morning like fog, thicker than smoke, heavy in his lungs. Even Thunder pawed nervously at the ground, catching whatever tension filled the air. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Faye sat cross-legged on the rug, with a crayon clutched tightly in her hand, her tongue sticking out in concentration. She was bent over a sheet of paper, scribbling with reckless purpose. Buck had tried not to hover, but every time she giggled or erased a line with her sleeve, he found himself leaning closer. When she finished, she didn't speak. She just turned the paper toward him with both hands like she was offering up a holy relic. It was a drawing of him. Big brown hat, longer legs than made any sense, sitting tall on Thunder with a red star on his chest and kids waving behind him. In blocky letters, she'd written, "Buck saves everybody." He stared at it for a long time, then looked at her. "You think I'm a hero?" Faye didn't hesitate. "No." His eyebrow lifted. "No?" She stood, brushing crumbs off her skirt. "Heroes come and go. They're like the men in storybooks. They do a big thing, then leave. I don't want that." She looked him square in the eyes. "I'm not scared, because you're here." It was the way she said it, like she didn't need him to be bulletproof or legendary. She just needed him to stay. Something shifted inside Buck, slow and deep, like the creak of timber that's held too much weight for too long. He knelt beside her, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Well," he said quietly, "then I guess I better be here a while longer." That night, Buck walked down to the sheriff's office, where Hayes was hunched over a worn map lit by lantern light. The older man looked up, startled. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I ain't wearing the badge," Buck said. "Didn't ask you to." "But I'll help." Hayes straightened. "Yeah? I know how Webb thinks. Where he'll strike first, what kind of men he rides with. If we're gonna keep this town from burning, we need more than locked doors and prayers." Hayes exhaled slow, then slid over the map. "Come look then." They worked for hours. Buck circled potential entry points: the North Ridge with the split pines, the dry creek bed east of the schoolhouse. He marked places Webb would use for cover, and where civilians could be funneled to safety. Hayes scratched notes, eyes narrowing at Buck's precision. "You sure you been out of the game 3 years?" he muttered. Buck didn't answer. By dawn, a loose plan had taken shape, a rotation of lookouts, reinforced barricades at the main roads, a fallback point in the church basement. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. When Buck stepped outside, the sky was bleeding orange along the horizon. He didn't go home. He walked instead to the hill beyond the stables, where he could see the town spread out below. He stood there a long while, watching the houses, the smoke trails, the scattered lives waking up beneath him. The past still clawed at him. The fire, the screams, the feel of his wife's hand going limp in his, the cold steel of the Colt in his grip when he couldn't save them. But that was then. And now there was Faye. Now there were drawings on the cabin wall. Now there was a girl who believed she was safe, not because the monsters were gone, but because someone had chosen to stay. He reached into his coat pocket and closed his fingers around the wedding ring. It was smooth from years of wear, yet it burned against his palm like it had just come from the forge. He didn't cry, but he did breathe. And when he walked down that hill, he walked like a man who'd chosen his ground. He didn't see the boy watching from the shadows of the livery. Didn't hear him mount up and ride hard into the trees. Didn't know the message would reach Marcus Webb before nightfall, but it would. And when it did, blood would follow. The letter came wrapped in dust and dread. It was wedged into the cabin door by a hunting knife, the kind Buck hadn't seen since the war. Its black hilt shimmered with oil, driven clean through the wood like a warning. Buck didn't touch it at first, just stared. Faye was still inside, humming while she braided 2 strands of hay together. The sound of her voice made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, like maybe peace wasn't just a word reserved for tombstones. He pulled the blade free with one hard yank. The envelope was plain, no return address, no wax seal. But the moment he unfolded it, a cold knot formed in his chest. The handwriting was cruelly neat. "I know you're in Red Bluff. I know about the girl. Brown hair, just like Emma. Does she scream like Emma did?" There was no signature, but Buck didn't need one. He folded the letter once, then again, then crushed it into his palm. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. "Buck?" Faye's voice was soft. "Is everything okay?" He turned slowly, forcing his face calm. "Just a message," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Faye wasn't stupid. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he stood like a man expecting bullets through the windows. She crossed the floor barefoot, stopping in front of him. "Is it about the bad men?" He hesitated, then knelt and looked her in the eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." Faye's mouth tightened, but she didn't cry. "Did they hurt your family?" she asked. He nodded. They hurt my mama too, she said, but that didn't stop me. No, he said, voice rough. It didn't. She squared her tiny shoulders. Then we won't let them win. Not this time. For a second, Buck forgot how to breathe. That night, the town buzzed with whispers. Word got out fast. Someone had seen a rider with Crimson Creek markings just outside the timberline. The message on the door spread faster than fire. People gathered in tight circles outside the saloon and the general store, voices sharp with fear. At the sheriff's office, Hayes slammed his hand on the table. We got women and kids here, Buck. This ain't just about you anymore. I know, Buck said, jaw clenched. I didn't ask for this. Doesn't matter. You're the reason they're coming. Hayes wasn't angry. He was scared, and Buck couldn't blame him. I'm not running, Buck said. Good, Hayes replied, because we need to make a stand. Buck nodded once. Then let's make it one they remember. The next few days passed in a haze of preparation. Men fortified windows with planks and barrels. The church bells were rigged with a wire system to sound alarms. Kids were moved into the schoolhouse basement, turned into a makeshift shelter. And through it all, Faye stayed close to Buck's side. She didn't ask to leave, didn't ask to hide. Instead, she sharpened pencils for the map room, brought biscuits to the watchman, sketched watchtowers with crayon. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the porch, Buck sat cleaning his Colt at the edge of the cabin. Faye appeared beside him, holding something behind her back. I made something, she said. He looked up. Yeah? What is it? She pulled out a strip of cloth, hand-stitched, a little crooked. On it was a single word, sewn in uneven thread. P-A-P-A. He stared at it like it was a live thing. You made this for me? She nodded. You said I don't have to be scared long as you're here. And, well, I'm not. So I figured maybe you're like my papa now. He didn't speak, couldn't. Faye looked uncertain. Is that okay? Buck took the cloth from her with trembling fingers, held it like it was made of gold. Yeah, he said thickly. Yeah, it's more than okay. She smiled and sat beside him, swinging her legs. The sky was quiet, the stars just beginning to bloom. And in the hush between them, neither of them heard the hooves pounding down the ridge outside town. But Marcus Webb had arrived, and he wasn't alone. The sound came first, a low rumble rolling over the hills like a dry thunder. Then the sharp, rhythmic clatter of hooves striking dirt, gaining speed, growing louder. By the time the dust cloud hit the northern road into Red Bluff, every man with a rifle was already stationed behind barrels, troughs, and overturned wagons. Sheriff Hayes paced behind a barricade near the post office, sweat trailing down his temple despite the chill in the morning air. And at the center of Main Street stood Buck Callahan, brown hat low, rifle resting steady in his massive hands, jaw tight, eyes unblinking. He didn't speak, didn't flinch. He just waited. The Crimson Creek gang burst into town like a black wave. 22 riders armed to the teeth, shotguns slung over shoulders, pistols drawn, rifles cocked. Red scarves marked their necks like warnings. The man at the front rode a black stallion, tall and proud, like he believed the world belonged to him. Marcus Webb. He pulled his horse to a halt in front of Buck. Well, well, Webb called, voice like a knife's edge. Look what crawled out of the ashes. Buck said nothing. Webb smirked. You got a lot of nerve standing out here like you mean to protect this dump. Buck's grip on his rifle didn't change. Leave now, or you won't leave at all, Webb's grin widened. I remember your voice. Sounded like that the night your wife screamed. The words landed like a slap, but Buck didn't blink, didn't even breathe hard. Behind the buildings, townsfolk crouched in silence, watching from behind shuttered windows. Hayes motioned for his men to hold fire. Webb leaned forward in his saddle. "You think you can stop us alone?" Buck's voice was low. "I'm not alone." With that, the church bell rang. Rope pulled from the back alley, loud and clear. From every shadow, rifles rose. The gang paused. Horses snorted. Webb chuckled. "Cute, but your little army's made of butchers and barkeeps." "You still bleed like anyone else," Buck replied. For a moment, everything stood still. Then someone fired. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the town like lightning. Bullets ricocheted off stone and wood. Men shouted, horses reared, smoke filled the air. Buck dropped to one knee, firing smooth, controlled shots. 2 riders fell before they cleared the saloon. A third went down when Sheriff Hayes dropped him from behind the stable. But there were too many. They kept pushing forward. Inside the cabin, Faye clutched the edges of the window, heart pounding, eyes wide. She'd promised Buck she'd stay hidden. But when she saw him stumble, shoulder clipped, blood starting to spread, something inside her broke loose. She ran, barefoot, no coat, no plan, just her voice. "Buck!" He turned, saw her sprinting into the street, just as Webb swung his pistol toward her. "No!" Buck roared. Webb smirked. "Pretty little thing." Just like Emma Faye froze. The barrel of the gun aimed directly at her chest. Buck moved. Time slowed. He threw himself forward, shoving Faye down behind a wagon. A shot cracked through the air. Pain exploded in his side. But he didn't stop. He rose, blood running down his coat, and charged. Fired once. Webb ducked. The shot grazed his shoulder. Buck staggered. Webb aimed again, closer now, but suddenly he couldn't move. Tiny hands clung to his arm. Faye. She had crawled out from behind the wagon and grabbed his gun arm, teeth clenched, eyes burning with fury. "You don't get to hurt people anymore," she growled. It was enough. Buck surged forward, tackled Webb into the dirt. They rolled, fists flying, gun lost, blood smeared. Webb fought dirty, but Buck fought like a man with nothing left to lose. With a final blow, Buck pinned him. Sheriff Hayes rushed in, rifle raised. 2 deputies dragged Webb away, still cursing, face broken and bloodied. The remaining gang, leaderless and stunned, fled into the hills under a rain of gunfire. It was over. Smoke hung heavy over Main Street. Crates splintered, horses bolted. A few townsfolk sobbed in the alleyways, and Buck was bleeding fast. He leaned against the water trough, trying to stay conscious. Faye ran to him, tears streaking her face, hands shaking as she pressed against the wound. "Don't die," she whispered. "I'm all right," he rasped. "You're not," she snapped, "but I'm not letting you go." He looked down at her, this brave, stubborn girl with dirt on her face and fire in her eyes. She pressed her forehead against his chest, gripping his coat tight. "You came back for me," she said softly. "Now I'm staying for you." Buck let out a shallow breath. But behind them, through the smoke and dust, another figure moved. Webb hadn't come alone, and one more gun was yet to be fired. The street was quiet now, not silent, not peaceful, just quiet. Smoke drifted upward from broken shutters and splintered fences. Shell casings littered the dirt, glinting in the slanting light of late afternoon. Somewhere a dog barked, then whimpered. A woman sobbed softly behind the boarded door of the bakery. And in the center of it all, Faye knelt beside Buck, her little hands slick with his blood. She had pressed her weight into his wound like Sheriff Hayes had yelled to do. But now that the shooting had stopped, she couldn't make herself move. Buck leaned against the side of the trough, barely conscious, head lolling forward as a warm breeze passed through the wrecked town. "Buck," she whispered, "please don't die." He didn't answer right away. His chest rose in shallow gasps, ribs working too hard. But when her voice cracked on the word, "Please," his eyes fluttered open. Faye let out a breath and grabbed his face with both hands. "You're okay," she said quickly. "You're still here." "You didn't leave me." His voice was barely there. "Course I didn't." She nodded fast, tears streaking down her dirt-covered cheeks. Behind them, the townsfolk had started to emerge, one by one, guns still in hand, boots crunching glass and gravel. Men from the lumber mill, Miss Templeton from the schoolhouse, even Old Man Doyle hobbling on his cane, holding a rusted revolver like it still had something to say. They all looked at Buck, and then at Faye, and then at each other. "We won, didn't we?" Faye asked, her voice trembling with something between shock and awe. "Tell me we won." Buck looked past her, taking in the battered front of the general store, the smoke curling from a broken wagon, the townsfolk slowly lowering their weapons. "Yeah," he said, "we won." But his tone wasn't triumphant. It was worn, sad, like he knew what it cost. Faye didn't let go. She just leaned in and hugged him tight, arms barely able to wrap around his wide frame. Her little voice muffled against his shoulder. "I was so scared." His fingers brushed the back of her head, then dropped. "I know," he rasped. "Me too." Thunder, his horse, wandered up beside them, somehow untouched by the bullets, though his reins were torn and his flank scraped. He lowered his great head and nudged Buck's arm gently. Faye turned and hugged the horse too. By nightfall, the town had started patching up what it could. Sheriff Hayes ordered the gang's bodies buried out past the ridge. Those that survived were locked in the church cellar until the marshals could take them. Women passed out biscuits and boiled water. The doc stitched Buck up with shaking hands and 2 bottles of whiskey. But the cabin, that quiet cabin at the edge of Red Bluff, was where Buck and Faye returned. She walked beside him, one hand on Thunder's reins, the other holding Buck's sleeve like it tethered her to earth. He winced with every step but said nothing. Inside, the fire still burned low. The sketchbook lay open on the table, pages fluttering with the night breeze. Faye helped Buck sit down. Then she curled up beside him on the worn old couch, Thunder's big head resting right next to them. She tucked her feet beneath her, pulled the blanket over both of them, and laid her head against his shoulder. "You're still bleeding," she murmured. "I've had worse. You should sleep." "I will." She didn't move, didn't speak for a long time. Then, in the softest voice, so soft Buck wasn't sure at first if he'd imagined it, she whispered, "Papa Buck?" He turned his head slowly, looked down at her. She was already half asleep, clutching Thunder's mane in one hand, his shirt in the other. "Yeah, little one," he whispered back. "You came back." His eyes burned. "I said I would." She smiled against his shoulder. Her breath grew steady, slow. The fire crackled. Outside, Red Bluff slept in the safest silence it had known in years. And as Buck looked at the girl beside him, her sketchbook still open to the drawing of a cowboy in a brown hat riding through fire to protect a town that didn't know it needed saving, he reached into his coat pocket. The wedding ring was still there, cold, heavy, real. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't holding on to it to remember what he'd lost. He was holding it to remember what he'd found. He looked at Faye. "You saved me too, little one." And in the shadows beyond the cabin door, just past the reach of firelight, a lone rider waited in the dark. Watching, waiting. The ring wasn't the only thing Buck would have to let go of. 6 months had passed, and Red Bluff looked like a place reborn. The broken shutters had been replaced. New glass sparkled in windows that used to hold bullet holes. A fresh sign hung outside the schoolhouse, hand-painted by the children, with daisies woven along the posts. Main Street had lost its constant tension. People no longer crossed the road to avoid one another. They stopped. They waved. They spoke. And in front of the little white church that sat on the hill above town, a photograph was being taken. Buck Tanner stood tall in a brown cowboy hat, a clean white shirt, and a dark vest that made him look almost like a preacher, if not for the wide stance, the calloused hands, and the deep scar that cut across his cheek like a line of history. Next to him stood Fay. Her blue dress had ruffles at the collar and a satin sash that tied at the back. Thunder, freshly brushed and ribboned, stood just behind her, his eyes gentle and alert. Fay's hair had grown longer. She wore it tucked behind one ear with a small silver clip Buck had given her that morning. She held Thunder's reins in one hand and Buck's hand in the other. The photographer, Old Man Doyle's nephew, visiting from San Antonio, adjusted the lens and told them to hold still. "I can't hold still," Fay whispered, bouncing on her toes. "This is too much." "You're doing fine," Buck said, smiling, an actual smile, wide and easy, and the first real one anyone had seen on his face in years. The camera clicked. There it was, captured, a moment that neither of them ever expected to have. Inside the church, the adoption papers sat on the pastor's desk, signed by the judge, Buck, and the town notary, Fay Elizabeth Parker Tanner. Legal, binding, forever. When they stepped down from the porch, people clapped. Mrs. Doyle brought pie. The schoolmarm gave Fay a new sketchbook. Sheriff Hayes stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, lips tight, but his eyes soft. He tipped his hat to Buck. "You did right." "I just followed her lead," Buck replied. At the picnic afterward, Fay sat in the grass feeding Thunder pieces of apple, laughing when he snorted into her palm. Buck leaned against the hitching post, watching her with the kind of quiet peace he thought was lost forever. "You look good in that vest," said a voice beside him. Buck turned to see Miss Templeton, the widow who ran the bakery. "Thanks." "And happier." "I am." She looked out over the field where Fay was now showing a younger girl how to draw horses. "She's a miracle, you know," Buck nodded. "She's a second chance." As the sun dipped low, casting everything in that golden wash of light, the West does best, Fay came bounding over and tugged at Buck's vest. "Can we go back to the cabin now? Thunder's tired, and so am I." He crouched slowly, still sore from the bullet wound in his side. "Of course we can." She leaned in and hugged him, tight and warm and without hesitation. "We're family now, right, Papa?" Buck swallowed hard. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "We are." She held out her pinky. "Promise you won't ever leave again." He hooked his pinky with hers. "Never." They rode home slowly, the girl in blue atop the giant horse, the cowboy walking beside her, reins in one hand, her sketchbook tucked under his arm. The sun slid behind the ridge, and somewhere in the shadowed canyon just beyond the horizon, a telegraph wire hummed to life. A single name tapped its way west, and someone on the other end wrote it down, his hand tightening on the pen. Buck Tanner. A man he thought was dead. A man who had something that once belonged to him. Chapter 10. Love is not weakness. The sun had barely crested the mesa when Buck Tanner opened the old cedar box tucked beneath the floorboard. He hadn't touched it in years, not since the night he buried his past with a bottle of rye and a burned-out rage that nearly took him with it. But today was different. Today, he needed a reminder. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth and dust, lay a letter. Its folds were brittle. Its ink had bled slightly from time and sweat, but the words still held firm, written in his father's square, steady hand, a man who died with a badge on his chest and faith in his son, even when the world had called that son a monster. Buck sat down in the wooden chair on the porch, sunlight streaking across his lap. Fay was off feeding Thunder, her braids bouncing, her laughter soft in the morning air. He unfolded the letter and began to read again. "Love is not weakness, my son. It is what makes strength worth having. You can be feared, you can be strong. But unless you know what you're standing for, all that muscle just makes noise. Don't close yourself off. Don't harden into stone. Find someone, something, even if it's small, that keeps you human. Buck exhaled. Long. Deep. He understood now. He looked out at the trail where his younger self had once ridden away from everything good in his life, thinking it would protect others from the curse of his shadow. Now that shadow was sitting in his lap, made lighter by the weight of a girl who refused to be afraid of him. Later that day, Sheriff Hayes rode out to the cabin. He wore his long duster and had 2 envelopes tucked in his vest. "You sure about this?" Hayes asked, squinting in the light. Buck nodded. "More sure than I've been about anything." Hayes handed over the tin star. It caught the sun and reflected back at them both. "Deputy Marshal Buck Tanner," he said, pinning it to his own chest with steady hands. "God help the bastards that try anything stupid," Buck smirked. "They'll learn real quick." Back inside, Faye was sitting at the kitchen table, her tongue pressed between her teeth as she wrote something on pale blue paper. She paused and glanced up. "Papa Buck?" she asked, voice gentle. "How do you spell soft?" "S-O-F-T, he said, stepping in, still adjusting the star on his vest. She scribbled it down and then blew on the ink. "Letter to your mama?" he asked. Faye nodded. "Just in case she's watching." Buck walked over and read over her shoulder. "Dear Mama in heaven, don't worry. Papa Buck keeps me safe, and I keep him soft. We built a house with laughter, and we don't run no more." He swallowed hard. Later that evening, as the sky bled into oranges and golds, they sat on the porch together. Thunder grazed nearby. The land stretched out quiet and wide. Faye leaned her head against Buck's arm, tired but peaceful. "You ever gonna take that badge off?" she asked sleepily. "Only when I'm sleeping," he answered. She looked up at him with a small grin. "Even tough guys need naps," Buck laughed, full and real. She cuddled in closer, clutching her stuffed bear patched up by Buck himself after a coyote incident. They didn't speak for a long while. Then Faye broke the silence. "What do you think love really is, Papa Buck?" He looked out over the valley, then down at her. "It's letting someone see the part of you that's still hurting, and letting them sit with it. Even the monsters? Especially them." The wind shifted, warm and dry, carrying with it the smell of sage and earth. It wrapped around them like a promise. From a distance, Red Bluff glowed, a town once broken, now rebuilding. Not perfect, but better. And out beyond it, where the land met sky and stories began again, a new trail waited. There were whispers of a railroad company pushing west, bribing landowners. A widow resisting an eviction. A wounded ex-soldier seen limping into town with a child on his hip. Trouble always came. But now Buck Tanner didn't run from it. He met it head-on. Because now he had someone worth staying alive for, someone who'd taught him that even in a land of blood and guns, there was room for gentleness, room for redemption, room for family, and maybe, just maybe, room for love too. If you've made it this far, partner, we thank you kindly for riding with us. Want more stories of outlaws, orphans, and the kind of cowboys who don't just fight but feel? Subscribe to Western Legacy, because the West ain't done telling tales, and neither are we.